Our speaker this morning is the Reverend Dr. Clint McCann. He is professor of biblical interpretation at Eden Theological Seminary in Webster Groves. His subject this morning is caring for creation as a Christian calling. Now, what we've done, we've extended, that was also the subject last week, and we've extended that to finish it and explore further that subject for today's session. So this time I'll turn it over to Dr. McCann.
All right. My mask and my glasses get mixed together sometimes. Thank you, Gary, for that introduction and for the invitation. You extended the invitation several months ago, actually. So I've been looking forward to this, and I welcome you and thank you all for being here this morning. As we said last week, when we decided to extend the topic. That's the first thing, Gary. So if you got a little outline from last week, I brought it back. It's inaccurate. We're still on the first topic, Christian calling, caring for creation as a Christian calling. As I said last week, this is an extraordinarily important topic. I mentioned Bill McKibben and his little book on the book of Job. Maybe we'll get to Job in the biblical material today. But he, as an environmentalist, says this is the most important moral issue facing humankind today. And I think he's right. So it's timely, it's perpetually timely, but it's been particularly timely these past 2 weeks because of the COP26 conference, the conference in Glasgow, Scotland, that gathers the nations of the world, or most of them, to talk about what, on an international level, are we going to do about the climate crisis. Now, actually, they talked so long that it was supposed to end on Friday, but it didn't end. I think it ended yesterday, but they were talking about it going into today. I'm not quite sure. But at any rate, there was a lot to talk about. And as we said last week, there are really no easy solutions. We're going to talk about, as I suggested, some of you were asking last time, well, what can we do about all this? Well, there are things we can do individually, congregationally, denominationally, nationally, internationally. There are things we can do, but very few of them are easy, you see. I mean, you can look on the news or your internet or whatever about what the results of the conference are. There were some agreements, but there was some disappointment, let's say, on the part, particularly of smaller nations that don't produce the massive greenhouse gases and emissions that we do, and China does, and India does, and Western Europe does, but they suffer by far the disastrous or potentially catastrophic consequences of climate change. Global warming is already going on, and it will continue even if we do our best. It's going to get worse for a while. So at any rate, it's a very timely topic. There were 6 handouts, I think, over there. It's a little bit overwhelming. Most of those were there last week. For those of you who were here last week, the 2 additions are 2 Episcopal documents. One that specifically has to do with COP26. I mentioned to you last week that you all, as Episcopalians, the presiding bishop had a delegation that participated in COP26, and these are the priorities. We can come back to those when we talk about things to do. And this document mentions this document, which is the Episcopal Covenant to Care of Creation. I've reproduced that for you. We'll look at that a little bit later too, particularly pages 1 and 2 that suggest things to be done on an individual level, a congregational level, a diocesan level, and a church-wide level. So we'll come back to those. But anyway, that's the new piece over there. Actually, I want to start, this document actually mentions on page 2, when it's under the diocese column, that one thing that can be done is to encourage use of Episcopal liturgical resources for season of creation which is usually in the fall. It's usually September into the first day of October, concluding on St. Francis Day. St. Francis of Assisi, of course, was big into caring for creation, animals, and so on. Encourage use of Episcopal liturgical resources for the season of creation and rogation days. More generally, not being Episcopalian, I would broaden that to use of liturgical resources as widely as possible. So I'm going to play one, a new liturgical resource that comes out of my tradition, as the Presbyterian tradition. This is a song, Light Dawns on a Weary World. You have the lyrics. It's on the one side of that lyric sheet. It's a new hymn, so it's illustrative of new liturgical resources that are being produced for the church, not just for the Presbyterian Church, but for the ecumenical church. And it's encouraging to see. That's one thing that we can continue to do, is to produce liturgical resources, hymns, prayers, songs, and so on, that go in the direction of creation and creation care. So listen with that in mind. This is Light Dawns on a Weary World. You can see the third verse in particular goes in the direction of creation care, alluding to the creature or mentioning the creatures. That's one of the issues these days. The extinction rates due to habitat loss and to change in habitat due to primarily to global warming, changing temperatures, and so on. So the promise green of Eden comes, but all of these things mentioned or alluded to here are interconnected. They're connected. Poverty, the dignity of the human family. I mean, that's one of the arguments at COP26. You all in the developed world are doing fine, and you want to continue to do fine. And we're the ones paying for your prosperity. You see, I mean, literally, in some cases, losing their countries in the case of Pacific Island nations and so on. So anyway, it's encouraging to see that liturgical resources are being developed. Now, that hymn that was written by Mary Louise Bringle, who was the editor of the new Presbyterian hymnal, or relatively new, it's several years old now, but relatively new. So that's my favorite hymn in the new, relatively new Presbyterian hymnal. So it's encouraging to see that liturgical resources, songs and prayers are being developed this way. We have, as Presbyterians, a new book of common worship. That would be the equivalent to your prayer book. It's different, of course, but with a different history. But the additions to our new Book of Common Worship are a series of resources and services for creation care. So it's happening. So look for those as Episcopalians. I know you have them because I know your denomination is doing really good things. So anyway, what we did last week, and the reason we extended this, we ended by talking about a quotation from this book by Episcopal laywoman Ellen Davis, who teaches at Duke Divinity School, Duke University, to the effect that what the Bible has to offer are not easy solutions or answers. There aren't any, but rather what the Bible has to offer is vision and principle, things that guide our thinking, and hopefully by guiding our thinking, will guide our action. We looked just briefly at Genesis chapter 1 last time and talked about dominion, how it has been problematic because it's been understood to mean we're in charge and we can do whatever we want to. But I had begun to suggest by way of the context, the immediate literary context, that dominion has to do with preserving the goodness and the beauty and the harmony of creation, the good assessment, God's assessment according to the. And I'm not taking Genesis 1 literally by any means. Ellen calls it Israel's creation poem, but poetry communicates truth, you see. So at any rate, we need and have been, as people of faith, Jews and Christians, rethinking dominion in the direction not of domination or being in charge or manipulation and control, but in terms of something like stewardship or responsibility. And in this area, creation care. There are a couple other things from the early chapters of Genesis that I want to highlight, and then we'll move to some other biblical passages. The relevant handout here, if you've got, would be this one that starts with a quote from Ellen Davis, actually, and then lists some key texts. We don't have time to talk about all those key texts, but I want to talk about a few of them and then leave some time for the question that came up last time. It's very important. And I said we'd come back to what can we do or begin to do, and so on. So anyway, a couple other quick things in Genesis 1 and 2. I don't know whether you have your Bibles, but these are familiar texts. One thing is just what the Bible, by way of the Hebrew language, calls us human beings. It's a word you know. For humanity. We usually think of it as a proper name because the name for humanity got assigned to the original male human, as it turned out. Again, I'm not taking this literally, but according to the story, Adam. We usually think Adam. Well, Adam, okay, that's humankind. It got translated for years and years as man, then humanity. But a better translation has been offered recently, and I'm going to tell you why. The Hebrew word for humankind is Adam. The Hebrew word for the earth or the ground or the tillable soil is what Ellen calls it, is Adamah. It's the same word. Hebrew works off 3-letter roots. You see, and depending on how you vocalize, or three consonants, depending on the vowels you put between those consonants, and sometimes before the first consonant or at the end of that word, determines what kind of the meaning and the part of speech, and it can be a verb, a noun, or so on, from the three-letter root. So this is the same three-letter root, Adam and Adamah, which has led Phyllis Tribble, very prominent Old Testament scholar, latter half of the 20th century into this century, to suggest the translation for Adam, earth creature, to remind us that we are, as human beings, biblically speaking, quintessentially creatures of this earth. Now, why is that important? Because it clearly implies that what we do to this earth affects our future, affects our well-being now, and of course, our well-being into the future. We are quintessentially, inevitably, inescapably earth creatures. Now, why is the reason I like to emphasize this? Because of this nonsensical talk about going to Mars. I don't doubt that we could put a colony on Mars if we wanted to. It would cost billions, if not trillions of dollars to do that. But what would it do if you put 12 people in pods on Mars? And people are already signing up to go to Mars. You see, what would that do? Nothing for the well-being of humankind on Earth. A colony on Mars would have to be resourced by what? Oxygen from the Earth, food from the Earth, technology that will control temperatures for the Earth, because Mars does not support life. You see, I mean, we could do that. Maybe we'll someday, but it's nonsensical. Everything that support a colonization of the universe, this Carl Sagan, for instance, had this weird idea that we could colonize the universe, you see, but we can't. If we did, everything that would resource that would have to come from Earth. We are inescapably creatures of this Earth. You see, we need to get very clear about that as individuals and as a race, as a human species, let's say. So that's one thing, Earth creatures. The other thing that sometimes comes up in this discussion, and rightfully so, is the vocation given to humankind in the second chapter of Genesis. We've got two creation stories. Remember, the first one is the priestly account, where God speaks the world into being. And the second one, God is more of a potter, forming clay and breathing into and so on. So at any rate, in that second account, I'm going to read it in a slightly different translation than the NRSV, which you may be used to. This is chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 15. The Lord God took the earth creature, that's Adam, took the earth, NRSV has man. The Lord God took the earth creature and put the earth creature in the Garden of Eden, and then it says to till it and keep it. Very poor translation. We could do better than that. I'm hoping that I've heard that there's a new NRSV coming out, and I hope that they'll change this to till and to keep. The word that they're translating till there does not mean till. We've got words in Hebrew that mean dig and stuff like that, plow and all that. The word means to serve, to serve. You see, the vocation of the earth creature, naturally, it would seem to me, is to serve the earth and keep it or preserve it. Ellen suggests that we translate that, and she's not the only one, other biblical scholars suggest it too, that there's a clue here as to the vocation of humankind is to serve and preserve the earth. For God's sake, I would say, to serve and preserve the earth, but there's a significant degree of self-interest there, legitimate self-interest, it seems to me, because if we do not serve and preserve the earth, we undermine our well-being and the future of the planet. As I said last time, I'm worried about us now, but I'm especially worried about my grandchildren, ages 12 and 8 and 4. What is the earth going to be like if it keeps going in the direction it's going now? You see, it's frightening to me. But anyway, to serve and preserve the earth. Here, I'm going to have you look at this list and just emphasize or highlight a few of the principles that may guide us as individuals, congregations, diocesan structures, and whatever, the church or humanity, as we think about the crisis that we are in. Just vision and principle. Exodus, let's be really quick, but I want to kind of give you an overview. Exodus 16, 1-21. Anybody know what that is right off the top of your head? I wouldn't expect anybody to. That's the manna in the wilderness. Remember that story, the manna in the wilderness? They've left Egypt in Exodus chapter 14. They celebrate, they sing a nice song to God to praise God for delivering them from captivity. In chapter 15, or the first part of chapter 15, and the last part of chapter 15, they're already complaining that they're thirsty. And then in chapter 16, they're complaining that they're hungry. So what does God do? According to the story. And again, you don't have to take it literally in order to derive vision or principle from it. They get manna. They, well, in Hebrew, the word manna means, what is it? They didn't know what it was. So they named it manna. What is it? But they could eat what is it? They knew that, and they did. But what was it about the manna that may lead to a principle that is quite timely, it seems to me? How did the manna work? Yeah, it's provided every day, and you couldn't store it up. So you couldn't commodify it. You couldn't save it and sell it to your neighbors or save it for next week. It was daily bread. Does that sound familiar? Give us this day our daily bread. There's almost certainly a connection between the manna story and the Lord's Prayer in terms of daily dependence upon God. So the principle that Ellen derives from that is a principle of limit or restraint. You can't go out and gather it all up and save it. You see, it's a kind of daily dependence. I mean, as I look at North American society or Western society in general, we're not particularly good at limiting ourselves. We're not particularly good at restraint. You see, we want more, better, and often those things, to our minds at least, go together. And that's part of the problem, of course, is we can't have more, and sustain and expect the earth to sustain our unlimited desires. Yeah.
Isn't it God that told us that we are perfectly entitled and have liberty to eat 24 hours?
I don't think so. Yeah, but see, this is the question. I mean, there is, as you know, as we all know, pervasive libertarian strain in the United States of America. And we're founded on liberty, and that's a good sort of principle. But that does not mean, the way some people take it, that I can do whatever I want to. I'm free. I don't have to wear a mask in a room of people because it's my right to, or whatever. You see, I'm free. So, but again, that's part of what we're up against in the climate crisis. We cannot do whatever we want to do, or whatever it may be in our power to do, and expect the results to be good if our desires are unlimited, or if we are infringing upon somebody else's right to life and well-being in the process. This is what the smaller nations are telling the larger nations at the COP26 conference. They've been telling us this for years. You doing whatever you want to. And your technology is better than our technology. You can get away with it, and you have armies and money and that we don't have. But we're human too. You see, we're in this together, is their point. And they have a point. We are in this together, and that's one of the basic principles I want to come to in terms of approaching the climate crisis and thinking about where we are and what we are to do. But the principle of restraint or limitation. Scientists tell us, I've read several statistics in this regard, that if, we like to think as Americans or North Americans, US citizens, I used to like to think that, well, we can, if we do the right things, we can bring the whole world up to our standard. The wealthy are fine, but we're all boats rise, you see. Well, if we were to bring the world, the rest of the world, up to the standards by which, or to which we have grown accustomed in the United States, scientists estimate it would take the resources of 4 to 5 Earths to sustain our typical standard of living in the United States. 4 to 5 Earths. We don't have 4 to 5 Earths. We are creatures of this one Earth. You see, that's the challenge. The Leviticus 25, nobody reads the book of Leviticus. Am I correct there? Actually, I don't know your Rogation Day liturgy very well. I'm not an Episcopalian, but I wouldn't be surprised if the book of Leviticus is in there somewhere. I don't recommend routinely that you read the book of Leviticus. There are a lot of totally irrelevant stuff there. But interestingly, Ellen Davis, your Episcopal colleague, by the way, I said last night, she's one of the very best biblical scholars in the entire world. So you Episcopalians are contributing mightily to the field of Old Testament studies, biblical studies, by way of supporting Ellen Davis and her identity as an Episcopalian laywoman. She says, interestingly, it was never occurred to me to think about this, that Leviticus may be the greenest book in the whole Bible. The most, because it cares about physical realities. There's all kinds of rules. Now, they're not rules that make sense to us, but there are all kinds of rules about land use and bodies and bodily emissions and what you wear and how you cook and what you eat and all these kinds of things. And that principle is what she says is so important, to be that careful in our time and place. It'll be different, but to be as careful in our time and place as the Levites were in their time and place about what we eat and how we get what we eat and how we treat the land and so on. So those are ecological decisions, all of them. Yeah.
I gotta bring this up real quick.
Okay,
One
sure.
of our best friends is a fine Jewish lady who's very kosher.
Uh-huh.
And we dine with her a lot. Recreation.
Yeah.
And I asked her one time, I said, now Leviticus mentions this, and she said, who's that? And she had been to Hebrew school.
And still didn't know Leviticus too well.
Leviticus was.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, why do you go to all this trouble? Because her mother told her to.
Yeah, right. Tradition, huh? Tradition. I was flipping around the TV last night looking for Duke basketball, I think it was, and Fiddler on the Roof was playing on Channel 9. Tradition. It's interesting, yeah. But we have not traditioned ourselves generally as thoroughly, perhaps, as she had been traditioned. So anyway, one verse out of Leviticus, that'll do it, or two verses actually. This is Leviticus 25 and the Jubilee year. Remember, every 50 years, they returned land to the original families and owners, so everybody would have a share in the land. And in an agrarian society, if you don't have a share in the land, you don't eat. It's a matter of everybody's dignity, everybody's survival, even. The verse is Leviticus 25, or the two go like this. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me, you are but aliens and tenants, or as one translation puts it, immigrants and tenants. Interesting to think of all of us as immigrants when it comes to the earth. But anyway, throughout the land that you hold, you shall provide for the redemption of the land. The redemption of the land. I mean, again, think of the principle involved, because nobody believes it. And it's a challenge. The land belongs, the earth belongs in the first instance from a biblical perspective, not to us, but to God. And if we don't redeem the land, there at some point will be no possibility of human redemption, if indeed we are creatures of the earth, you see. So anyway, that principle, a monumental challenge. Now, this list has way more than we can talk about here today. I'm going to just turn quickly to one prophetic text from the book of Hosea. I mentioned one from Jeremiah, but just one from the book of Hosea to illustrate kind of how, without knowing it, perhaps, there's no Hebrew word for environmentalist, but they sound at major points like advocates for creation care. This is Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, and it sounds chillingly contemporary to me. This is an indictment by the prophet Hosea of the northern kingdom. This would have been in the mid 8th century BCE, somewhere around the year 750 BCE. The people are being criticized for their disobedience. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There's no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. In other words, violence and more violence. That actually sounds all too contemporary to me. But what really is chillingly contemporary is the results of human malfeasance or human disobedience. Here's how the prophet described it. This is chapter 4 of Hosea, verse 3. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing. Now, I think that this is poetry. I think Hosea didn't necessarily mean that literally, but what's so frightening to me is this is literally happening in our midst. You see, the land mourns. All kinds of storms and fires and, catastrophic things. The land mourns. Some islands in the Pacific have already disappeared. Desertification is happening in major parts of the world. California may be a desert in a few years if we don't change the way we do things. At any rate, the land mourns together with the wild animals. Species disappearance. We mentioned briefly last time. Species are disappearing now at a rate of perhaps 1,000 times higher than species have always disappeared in the course of natural history. Species have always disappeared, true, but they've never disappeared this quickly, you see, and the cause is clear. Biologists call this current reality the 6th great extinction spasm in the history of the planet. The other 5, we don't know what caused them, although the 5th one was probably caused, scientists say, by a meteor. Or meteorite, what do you call it when it hits the earth? Wiping out the dinosaurs because of us shielding the sun for literally months, if not years on end. That was probably the 5th great extinction spasm. That's 65 million years ago or so. We don't know for sure, but we do know for sure what is causing the high rates of extinction now. There's no doubt about it. It's human activity that impinges upon habitats and the environment itself. So at any rate, the wild animals, the birds of the air, scientists estimate, it's probably a pretty good estimate, that over the last 50 years, 3 billion songbirds have disappeared. 3 billion songbirds have disappeared. Even the fish of the sea are perishing. The overfishing of oceans and seas and so on, plus the changing climate that changes water temperatures and so on, putting a strain on wildlife, including fish. So anyway, again, Hosea would never have read this the way I just read it. But we read this in our place and time as a warning, you see, that human behavior has an impact, not just on the human community, it obviously does. What we do affects each other. But what we do affects the earth, you see, and we are, as we said to start with, earth creatures. I'm just going to mention real quickly the book of Job because Bill McKibben has this book. It was published by Cowley Press, which also has an Episcopal connection, I think, doesn't it? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Cowley. I think somewhere it says that it was an Episcopal order that runs Cowley Press, I believe. But at any rate, Bill McKibben, the major environmental, he's not a biblical scholar, derives from the book of Job, particularly chapters 38 to 41. And we don't have time to read those, but that's God's answer to Job, who was complaining about his suffering and so on, and why have I been singled out and all this kind of stuff. It was a good question. But when God answers Job, doesn't tell Job anything about the test. He doesn't tell Job he's suffering because he's good instead of because he's bad. That's the whole point of the book, is to demolish the doctrine of retribution. But all God talks about in chapters 38 to 41 is creation. Doesn't mention humankind, just talks about wild animals, ostriches and goats and just all kinds of stuff. And it's weird, as biblical scholars think, it's evasive on God's part. But not really, because what Job has done in the beginning of the book is to deny the goodness of creation by alluding to Genesis 1 and Psalm 8, these creation texts, and turning them on their head and suggesting that because I'm suffering, creation is no good. And God responds by giving Job a marvelous portrayal of the creation and all its wildness and wonder. And the effect, and I think Bill McKibben is right, it comes down to a word. What Job learns in a word, Bill McKibben says, as a representative human, is humility. Humility. You see, it's not all about us from God's perspective. The earth is not all about us. You know, what have you seen what philosophers and some scientists are calling the current era? You know, we have all these Pleistocene and all these kinds of things to designate geological time. This is not an official scientific designation, but what are we calling, what are a lot of people calling the current era? Well, it's certainly characterized by entitlement. The Anthropocene, anthropos being the Greek word for humankind, would be the equivalent of Adam in Hebrew. The Anthropocene, because we are so oriented to thinking that the earth and everything is oriented to us. You see, it doesn't matter if we wipe out a certain species, if we build a dam over here and all these fish die or whatever. Doesn't matter if we wipe out, forest, rainforest or whatever. It doesn't matter. It does matter. You see, and that's what we're beginning to realize, but only beginning to realize that what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. We are earth creatures. So at any rate, Job learns a lesson in humility. It would be an extraordinarily important lesson given the pervasive sense of entitlement that affects individuals, of course, but it affects nations and international relationships as well. Again, this is part of the issue with the COP26. We, United States, Western Europe, China, India, Russia, big, rich country, think we deserve everything we have, forgetting conveniently that what we have came at some other people's expense in this country, indigenous folk.
Or thanks to other people's work.
And slavery. I mean, the wealth of the United States was by and large built on land that we took. There were 500 treaties, by the way, made between the United States government and the native nations on this continent. 500 treaties. How many of them were broken by the United States? 500. Yeah. You see, so we don't like to remember those inconvenient sorts of truths about how we got where we are today. So anyway, another principle would be humility as opposed to entitlement on all sorts of levels. One more, and then maybe we should stop at that. Although I do want to mention these Psalms here, since I'm actually a Psalm scholar, and maybe one verse from the Psalm. Okay, one verse from the Psalms. I can't skip the Psalms entirely. It's just the last verse in the book, but it's extraordinarily important because it's a call to worship. And notice who is called to worship. This is 150, Psalm 150, verse 6. Let everything that breathes praise the Lord. Let everything that breathes praise the Lord. Now, again, this is poetry, liturgical poetry in this case, and it's imagining a worship service. But who's involved in this worship service, as it were? Who's involved in praising God?
Everything breathes.
Everything, which is not people, yeah, but everything that, all the creatures. I would include the trees. The song we played at the beginning talks about the trees clapping their hands. That's Isaiah 55, by the way. The last couple of verses of Isaiah 55, but Psalm 96 has the trees singing for joy and so on. I think we probably should imagine when we come to worship. It's not just our group here, you all, in this St. Timothy's sanctuary or whatever. We are somehow worshiping with everything that has breath, or should think of ourselves as worshiping with everything that has breath. You see, we are in this together as creatures of the earth. And again, the part of the message is we are creatures too. Again, we conveniently like to forget that. But the vision of a unified creation where every person and every creature has its place. I've been reading not just theology recently and biblical studies, but biology. This is The Diversity of Life by E.O. Wilson. And he says at one point that so important are insects and other land-dwelling arthropods that if all were to disappear, humanity probably could not last more than a few months. I think he extended that out a bit to a few years in a later book, but think about that. We can't live. It's E.O. Wilson. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's taught at Harvard. He knows what he's talking about. He's an ant specialist, so he knows about insects. We can't live. Now, who knows this? I didn't know this. We can't live without bugs and insects, you see, performing their ecological service of pollination and decomposition and so on. We can't or wouldn't, which again makes it very frightening to me when I read the Post-Dispatch that scientists decry world's ongoing insect apocalypse. Insects are disappearing at a rate of 1 to 2% of the insect population per year, according to the entomologists that study these sorts of things. Now, if that rate continues, it won't take long till there aren't very many insects left, if any, you see. And what's that going to do to the human community? So again, I'm much more inclined to think about worshiping with bugs and insects in the congregation, you see, and imagination. Now, I want to keep the mosquitoes out. And I don't want spiders to bite me. But again, we're in this together as a creational community. Okay, that's enough biblical stuff. There's a lot more we could say, but let's turn to some of the things that we might begin to do or think about doing at least. We have about 10 minutes here, I think. I brought some books. I've accumulated a little library on biblical stuff and environmental stuff. This is a little book called How Many Light Bulbs Does It Take to Change a Christian? You see, so there's some advice. And some of these things will sound, a rain barrel could collect 623 gallons of water that you could use in your yard every time it rains an inch. If you have a 1,000 square foot roof, you see, which is not that big. Little things like that. Turning down your thermostat by 1 degree could reduce your energy consumption by 10%. Channel 5 had a St. Louis weather show last night. They suggested turning down your thermostat 10 to 15 degrees at night. I don't know what you'd leave it on in the daytime, but again, energy production in the United States is largely fossil fuel, coal in particular, which is particularly bad in terms of emissions, but gas and oil. And I mean, who doesn't want to heat their house though? We heat our house on natural gas. There's stories about natural gas shortages possibly this summer or winter that Spire is putting out. The Sierra Club says it's a hoax, but who knows? This part of our dilemma is that we have created a society that depends on fossil fuels. And we have, legislatively given large subsidies to energy companies to drill and discover new sources and so on. I mean, there's a lot of people. We depend on that. It's hard to change that. And it's not going to change overnight, but it can change incrementally. And this is what COP26 and all these conferences are about. And in the meantime, there are little things that we can do, changing from incandescent bulbs to LED. Saves a lot of energy. These are relatively easy things, but they're relatively small things. But if enough people did them, it would make a difference. So anyway, things like that. Here's a list in this book entitled Christianity, Climate Change, and Sustainable Living. Here's the easy list, okay? Turn off unnecessary lights, unplug appliances, use power strips to turn off home electronics like TVs, DVDs, CDs, and so on. Computers. Turn your heating system down by 1 degree, they say, and air conditioner up by 1. That's way below 10 to 15. When it gets cold, reach for a sweater instead of thermostat. Close curtains in the daytime. Set your water heater at 120. Ensure that washing machines, dryers, or dishwashers are full when used. In other words, don't run them after every meal. Defrost the freezer regularly. Hang your washing outside. We didn't have a dryer when I was a kid. We hung all our stuff outside, but nobody does that now, or very few people who can afford appliances do that. And it's actually illegal in some of the suburbs around here to hang your clothes outside. Yeah, I'm serious. Consider collecting water from air conditioning units or rain barrels and so on. We'll save money. Here's a list that's harder to do, that will save money in the long run, but will cost you in the short run. Replace incandescent light bulbs, seal air leaks in your home, windows and so on, crawl spaces. Give your electronic hot water heater an insulating jacket, install high efficiency appliances, consider replacing your heating and cooling systems if more than 15 years old, install a programmable thermostat, look for Energy Star appliances, install solar panels if you can, and so on. You see, so there are little things, some are easier than others, that we can do. But I mentioned last time the book by Thomas Friedman, the New York Times foreign affairs correspondent, who's very attuned to ecological issues as well, says it's important. Do the little things, reuse, reduce, recycle. Yes, do those things. Drive better mileage cars or electric cars. Yes, do all that. He says, but it's going to take in the long run big changes that are hard to do because we're so entitled, not just as individuals, but as nations. So we don't want to live more simply that others might simply live, for instance. It's hard legislatively to get that kind of degree of political will, let's say. Look in our last 5 minutes or so at I just call your attention to these. We don't need to go over this, but as I said, you all as Episcopalians, your presiding bishop had a delegation at COP26. I think it was virtual. I don't know whether they were there in Glasgow in person or not, but they were a participant. And these are the goals of the presiding bishop's delegation. And some of these goals pertain to your Episcopal covenant to care of creation. So if you're not aware of that, I just went to your website and I photocopied it for you, so you've got a copy. But there's lots of other good resources on your website too, under the click that's creation care. But notice how it's organized. Things. It's really page 1 is sort of an overview of the categories. Loving formation. For God's sake, we will grow our love for the earth. For God's sake, you see, it helps me to think I'm not doing these things that I try to do just for my sake and my grandchildren's sake. Yes, but it gives me a little bit more motivation, let's say, or to think we do this for God's sake. God loves the world. By the way, there's a sermon by is it Curry, your presiding bishop? There's a sermon you can click on too. And his sermon, I listened to part of it last night, is on John 3:16. For God so loved the world. And he's pointed out that made a difference to him when he learned that the Greek word there is cosmos. God so loves the universe, the cosmos, and enjoys apparently human life and animal life, as Job 38:41 says, and the life of creation. So at any rate, page 2 really gets at some of the things under these categories: individual, congregational, diocesan, and church-wide. Notice at the bottom for both individual under life-giving conservation, and this is a really important ecological issue, make conscious choices about food and land use. Local consumption and local production and local consumption in particular, it seems to me, are critically important. And we've organized our society in such a way that we're spread out and we depend on big agriculture. That's going to continue for the foreseeable future, to be sure, and may have to continue on and on and on. But it's possible to be more locally centered. Local production, local consumption, it's beginning to happen. There's a marked increase in community-supported agriculture in the last 10 to 15 years, farmers markets and so on. When you buy local, you don't have to transport the food. Do you look at the fruit when you buy fruits in the grocery store, where it's coming from? And notice it's available year round. Everything's available to us year round because we're flying it in. From where? Not just California, although a lot of it comes from California. That's Chile, yeah, South America. Yeah, bananas are all of them are from some Central or South America, but blueberries, all these other, what's that?
Still getting strawberries.
Strawberries, yeah, all the, and who wants to do without that? Fruit's good for you. You see, we need to eat more fruit. But, for most of human history, people ate what they could grow and seasonally and locally. We think we're entitled to better than that. You see, so anyway, but care to how we eat, what we eat, how it's grown. I mentioned last time the United States Department of Agriculture is trying, now is actually paying farmers in some cases to cover crop, not to leave bare land out. That's carbon into the air. So how we grow our food, how we do agriculture needs to change. It needs to change dramatically. If you want to further read on this, go to, I think I mentioned it last time, kisstheground.com. It's a movie that tells you not just how do we cut down on our carbon emissions, but how do we capture the carbon that's already out there and put it back in the ground. Plants could do that. That's why we can't live without trees, you see, which is why I like to include them in the worshiping congregation, by the way. I like to include trees. So anyway, be aware of resources that are coming out of your Episcopal structures and institutions, because it's very important and you all are doing a good job. And I'm going to share this with my students at Eden Seminary, only a few of whom are Episcopalian, but we all need to learn from this. Again, thank you all for your time and attention and the opportunity to be with you, and go in peace. Thank you.
Just one quick announcement. Stay tuned for the spring. Mother Cammie's putting together a couple forums for us. She's going to invite Interfaith Power and Light to come in and talk about what we can do here as a church. And then the youth group is actually working on projects and apply for grants to do some work here with the church to reduce our energy consumption and things like that. So stay tuned.
Interfaith Power and Light is mentioned in your documents as a cooperating organization. So yeah, and they will have even more on what to do and how to do it. Things that can be done individually and congregationally. Yeah, good,
Great.
good. Yeah,
Thank you.
glad to hear that.